They stood unarmed, their wrists bound, their fates sealed under the unforgiving glare of a December sun. 100,000 souls, men, women, the elderly, even children, awaited what none dared believe would truly come. It wasn't a battlefield that awaited them, but an execution ground. The year was 1398, and Timur, known to the world as Tamerlane, had arrived at the gates of Delhi not only with an army, but with a message written in terror and flame. The battle for Delhi had already ended. The Sultan's war elephants had panicked in fire, Timur's flaming camels sending chaos through their ranks. Delhi had fallen. But the true horror began only afterward. These captives, mostly Hindu civilians and warriors taken during Timur's relentless march through India, were seen as a threat, a potential uprising waiting to ignite. Timur issued his order, cold and absolute. All 100,000 prisoners were to be executed in a single night. No exceptions, no mercy. Executioners worked in shifts beneath the moonlight, their swords rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. The screams of the dying blending with the clatter of chains and the rustle of blood-soaked sand. This was no act of madness. It was psychological warfare at its most calculated. Timur sought not only to kill bodies, but to annihilate hope. The massacre at Delhi was his warning to the world: resist and face extinction. They thought surrender would save them. Isvahan, glorious, cultured, prosperous, opened its gates to Timur without resistance, believing submission would spare them his fury. But they misunderstood the man who called himself the Sword of Islam. When a rebellion broke out and several of his occupying troops were slain, Timur didn't merely retaliate. He orchestrated one of the most haunting massacres in medieval history. The retribution was swift and merciless. According to Yazdi's Zafarnama, 70,000 men, women, and children were executed. Other sources claim up to 200,000. It wasn't just the scale of death that stunned the world. It was what came after. Timur ordered the construction of 28 towering pyramids, each one built from human skulls. They rose above the blood-soaked earth like monuments to despair, a visual symphony of terror, engineered to crush the will of every city that dared defy him. These weren't chaotic piles of bone. They were methodically arranged. Soldiers, scholars, merchants, even clerics, sorted and stacked with cruel precision. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not be tolerated. Resistance would be erased. Travelers passing through Isfahan years later reported that some skulls still remained, bleached by sun and time, yet unforgotten. Timur didn't deny this horror. He embraced it. For him, fear wasn't a consequence of war. It was a weapon. The skull pyramids of Isfahan were more than warnings. They were declarations of unstoppable dominion. They believed they had secured mercy. After a tense siege in 1400, the defenders of Sivas, 3,000 strong, surrendered to Timur, clinging to the promise that no blood would be spilled. But they misunderstood what Timur meant by mercy. And in that misunderstanding, they sealed their fate. The men were not run through by swords. They were not decapitated or burned. Instead, Timur ordered the earth itself to become their executioner. Massive trenches were dug. The prisoners, bound and stripped of hope, were herded into them like livestock. Then, with chilling precision, his soldiers began to fill the graves, shovelful by shovelful, burying the men alive beneath layers of silence and soil. No screams could save them. No mercy came. The Persian chronicler Yazdi, in his Zafarnama, recounted the horror in haunting detail. Timur had kept his word, technically. No blood had been spilled. But the betrayal was absolute. This wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare. A statement. A warning. What happened at Sivas echoed across Anatolia. Cities that once considered defiance quickly submitted. The message was clear. Timur's promises were riddles. His mercy, a trap. His justice, a slow suffocation. Even centuries later, the horror at Sivas remains a symbol of how terror can be sharpened not with swords, but with words twisted into weapons. In Timur's hands, language itself became lethal. Timur was not merely a conqueror of cities. He was a master architect of fear. His campaigns were not random acts of war. They were precision-crafted instruments of psychological devastation. Where others sought territory, Timur sought obedience. Absolute, unquestioning, and enforced not just by steel, but by memory. His methods were calculated, each massacre a message, each ruin a warning. The Pyramid of Skulls in Isvahan, the 100,000 captives slaughtered in Delhi, the mass burial at Sivas, these were not anomalies. They were deliberate chapters in a doctrine of terror. Timur did not rely solely on swords. He weaponized spectacle. His armies didn't just kill, they erased, they humiliated, they etched fear into the minds of survivors and observers alike. Even his mercy was laced with cruelty. Promises were kept to the letter but twisted in spirit. Surrender was never safety. It was submission to theater. The fires he lit were not just physical, they burned in memory, in legend, in the whispered warnings passed from city to city. Resistance meant not just defeat, it meant extinction. To face Timur was to confront not only death, but a legacy of suffering so immense it reverberated through generations. His power did not fade with the fall of his empire. It lived on in the silence of cities that dared not rebel again. In Timur's hands, terror became policy, fear became law, and history bore witness to the mind behind the massacre. Timur's empire was not built on diplomacy or governance. It was forged through fire, bone, and the silence that follows terror. When his armies marched, they did not simply conquer. They erased civilizations. Cities that resisted did not fall. They vanished. Their names remembered only in the whispers of survivors or in the ash beneath Timur's horse. He didn't need walls or monuments to assert his power. He used corpses. He turned cities like Delhi, Isvahan, and Sivas into living tombs, monuments to his cruelty. No mercy was shown, no age, no faith, no status spared. Whether it was the robed cleric, the innocent child, or the hardened soldier, Timur's wrath was blind, but never directionless. Each act of terror was choreographed with surgical intent. Even in surrender, no safety existed. Cities that laid down their arms were often betrayed, buried alive, beheaded en masse, or burned while the smoke signaled their fate to neighboring regions. His promises were riddles, his treaties, traps. The world learned that under Timur, the greatest danger was not to fight, but to trust. Yet his terror worked. Entire kingdoms crumbled without battle. Rulers bowed in fear before swords were drawn. He left no enduring institutions, no philosophical legacy, only nightmares. Timur's was not an empire meant to last. It was an empire meant to be remembered. And it is. In every scorched ruin and every whispered tale of skull towers, Timur's shadow still falls, long, dark, and unforgettable. Timur's legacy is not one of civilization, but of devastation. He built no golden age, no age of peace, only monuments of fear, carved in blood and bone. His empire collapsed within decades, but the horrors he unleashed echo across centuries. Cities turned to ash, rivers ran red, the very earth seemed to recoil beneath the weight of his cruelty. And yet, history remembers him, not as a forgotten tyrant, but as a specter that haunts the margins of maps and memory. His name conjures not admiration, but dread. He reminds us that power without conscience is the deadliest force of all, that the thirst for domination, when unbound by mercy, leaves behind no glory, only graves. As we look back on Timur's reign of terror, we are forced to confront an unsettling truth. It is not always the builders of empires who shape history, but the destroyers. Not every monument is made of marble. Some are made of skulls. So ask yourself, what would you have done if Timur's banners appeared on your city's horizon? Fought? Fled? Surrendered? In the shadow of such terror, there was never a right answer. Only survival, if you were lucky. Let us not forget, let us not repeat. History is a warning, not just a record. And Timur's story, above all, warns us what happens when fear becomes law and cruelty becomes the empire. The story of Timur teaches us a chilling truth. When power goes unchecked and fear replaces justice, humanity suffers. In today's world, while we no longer face conquerors on horseback, we still witness oppression through silence, manipulation, and abuse of authority. The lesson? Never stay passive in the face of injustice. Speak up. Protect the vulnerable. Question cruelty masked as leadership. History warns us, when we ignore small acts of tyranny, they can grow into forces that destroy nations. Let's build a society grounded in empathy, transparency, and courage, before fear ever has a chance to rule again.